Medieval food. Mistakes that could kill you. Imagine yourself waking before sunrise in a small medieval town. The room is still dark. The air is cool, and somewhere beyond the wooden walls, a rooster calls into the early morning. You hear the quiet movement of people beginning their day. A door opens. Footsteps pass over a packed earth street. Nearby, someone is already tending a small fire. There is a faint smell of smoke in the air. And then, slowly, another smell reaches you. Bread. Warm bread, perhaps mixed with rye or barley, baking near a hearth. For a moment, the medieval world seems peaceful. Food is warming. People are waking. The day is beginning. Yet food was never simply food in the medieval world. For most people, every meal depended on weather, harvests, storage, trade, animals, fuel, and luck. A mistake in handling something edible could sometimes mean little more than an unpleasant meal. But sometimes the consequences were much more serious. A piece of meat kept too long, milk handled carelessly, grain damaged by dampness, water contaminated by nearby waste, a pot that was not cleaned properly, a plant gathered because it looked similar to another plant, a barrel of food stored in the wrong place. These were not always dramatic mistakes. Often, they were ordinary decisions made by ordinary people who were trying to make food last. And that is what makes the history of medieval food so interesting. The people living centuries ago did not think of themselves as living in a dangerous food world. To them, these practices were simply part of daily life. They knew many things that modern people sometimes forget. They knew when certain fruits appeared. They knew how long a loaf could remain edible. They knew which herbs were useful. They knew how to preserve meat with salt. They knew how to dry fish. They knew how to ferment drinks. They knew how to judge milk, eggs, and grain by sight and smell. Their knowledge was practical knowledge, passed from one generation to another. But practical knowledge was not perfect. A medieval household could do many things correctly and still make a mistake. And sometimes, the mistake could remain invisible until it was too late. So, quietly, let us step into that world. Not as warriors, not as kings, not as people watching history from a distant throne. Instead, picture yourself as someone living an ordinary life. The floor beneath your feet is hard. The walls are made from timber, stone, clay, or a mixture of materials depending on where you live. There is no refrigerator humming in the corner. There is no supermarket waiting at the end of the road. There is no printed label telling you when something was packaged. There is no thermometer to tell you precisely whether food has been kept at a safe temperature. Your kitchen is not separate from the rest of your life. The hearth provides warmth. It provides light. It cooks your food. It dries some of your belongings. It may even become the center of the household during the coldest months. And because the fire is so important, food preparation revolves around it. A pot hangs over the flames. Water begins to warm. Vegetables are cut. Grain is ground. Bread dough is shaped. Perhaps a small piece of meat is being prepared for the evening meal. Everything seems ordinary. But now imagine that the meat was slaughtered several days earlier. It has been kept without modern refrigeration. The household has no choice but to preserve it or eat it quickly. The people who prepared it understand this. They are not careless simply because they lack modern technology. They have their own methods. Salt can draw moisture from meat and slow spoilage. Smoking can help preserve food. Drying can remove water. Fermentation can transform milk, grain, fruit, or other ingredients into products that last longer. Cool cellars can protect certain foods from heat. Containers can protect grain from some insects and moisture. These techniques were valuable because medieval people understood something through experience that remains true today. Food changes with time. The challenge was knowing when that change had become dangerous. That boundary was not always obvious. A piece of salted meat might look perfectly normal. A loaf might have only a small patch of mold. Milk might have changed slightly in taste. Grain might carry a strange smell. A barrel might contain water that looked clear. Appearance could be misleading. And this is where our journey begins. Not with one terrible meal, but with a simple question. How did ordinary people decide whether food was safe? The answer takes us into the heart of medieval daily life. For much of the medieval period, preservation was not an optional convenience. It was necessary. Harvests arrived in seasons. Animals were not necessarily slaughtered every day. Fish might be caught in large quantities at particular times. Fruit could appear in abundance for a short period and then disappear for months. Grain had to survive from one harvest to the next. A household, therefore, had to think beyond today's meal. It had to think about winter. Imagine a village in late summer. The fields have been worked for months. The grain is finally being gathered. The air is warm. Dust rises from the paths. The smell of dry grass hangs over the settlement. People know that the work being done now may determine whether they eat comfortably during the coming winter. The grain is not merely food, it is security. It is bread. It is porridge. It may become ale. It may be exchanged for other necessities. A successful harvest can make a household feel safe. A poor harvest can make the months ahead frightening. So the grain must be stored carefully. This sounds simple, but grain is vulnerable. Moisture can ruin it. Insects can infest it. Rodents can consume it. Poor storage can encourage mold. A damaged store can become a slow disaster. And yet medieval people had methods for dealing with these problems. Grain could be dried. Storage areas could be designed to reduce dampness. Containers could protect some supplies. Raised storage structures could help keep grain away from moisture and animals. People also relied heavily on their senses. They could inspect grain. They could smell it. They could feel it. They could notice changes. But sensory judgment was not a perfect scientific test. Some harmful contamination is not obvious. This is an important distinction when looking back at medieval food. It would be easy to imagine that medieval people simply ate rotten food without understanding the danger. That would be unfair. They had considerable food knowledge. The problem was that their knowledge was based largely on observation and experience rather than modern microbiology. They knew that some food spoiled. They knew that some foods made people sick. They knew that certain plants were dangerous. They knew that dirty water could cause illness. But they did not know about bacteria, viruses, or many of the microscopic organisms that modern science can identify. That difference shaped everyday decisions. Consider milk. Today, we understand the importance of controlling contamination and temperature. Medieval households had no refrigeration and no pasteurization in the modern sense. Fresh milk was therefore a food that needed to be consumed relatively quickly or transformed into something more durable. Cheese offered one solution. Fermentation offered another. But these processes were not simply ways of making food taste different. They were ways of making valuable nutrition last longer. A household with milk from a cow or goat could turn it into products that survived beyond the immediate freshness of the liquid. This was practical food preservation. Still, every process carried its own risks. A person could use the wrong container. A vessel could be poorly cleaned. An environment could be too warm. A batch could become contaminated. And without modern testing, the household had to depend on experience. The same was true of eggs. Eggs were valuable because they provided nutrition and could be stored for a period of time. But storage conditions mattered. A medieval household did not have the same ability to control temperature and cleanliness that we have today. People therefore developed local habits for preserving and using eggs. These habits varied by region and period. The same was true across almost every medieval food. There was no single medieval diet. A wealthy household in England did not eat exactly like a farming family in France. A merchant in an Italian city had access to different foods from a peasant living in a remote village. A monastery could have different storage facilities from a small rural household. A coastal community could rely heavily on fish. An inland community might depend more heavily on grain and dairy. Climate mattered. Religion mattered. Trade mattered. Social status mattered. And all of these differences affected food safety. Now picture a medieval market. The morning has brightened. The streets are busier. You hear voices around you. Someone is selling vegetables. Another person has baskets of eggs. A fish seller calls out to passing customers. There are grains, cheeses, fruits, herbs, bread, and perhaps meat. The market is not simply a place where food is exchanged. It is a place where trust matters. A customer must decide what to buy. A seller must protect valuable goods. And both must understand the difference between food that is still usable and food that has deteriorated. In a world without modern packaging, food often revealed itself directly. You could touch it, you could smell it, you could see it. But that direct contact also meant that food was exposed to the environment. Dust, animals, hands, water, containers, surfaces, weather. The market could be clean or dirty depending on the place, the period, the local regulations, and the habits of the people working there. Medieval towns sometimes developed rules concerning food sellers, weights, measures, and the handling of particular goods. Authorities understood that bad food could become a public problem. The details varied enormously across medieval Europe, but regulation of markets and food production was not unknown. This tells us something important. People recognized that food quality mattered. They were not unaware of the problem. But regulation could only go so far. A rule written by a town authority could not eliminate every mistake. A seller might misjudge the condition of food. A household might buy something that had already begun to spoil. A storm might delay transportation. A warm day could change food faster than expected. And so, beneath the ordinary rhythm of medieval meals, there was a constant negotiation with time. Eat it now. Preserve it. Sell it. Trade it. Cook it. Dry it. Salt it. Ferment it. Or throw it away. For a poor household, throwing food away was not always an easy choice. This is one of the most important parts of understanding medieval food mistakes. When food was scarce, people had strong reasons to avoid waste. A household that had worked hard to obtain a small amount of meat or grain could be reluctant to discard it, simply because it looked questionable. The economic pressure could be enormous. Food represented labor. It represented land. It represented animals. It represented fuel. It represented time. Throwing food away could feel like throwing away the work of an entire family. And sometimes, that pressure could lead people to take risks. Imagine a household preparing a meal after a long winter. There is little fresh food available. The stored supplies are becoming less attractive. The grain is still usable. The dried vegetables are nearly gone. The preserved meat has a strong smell. Someone looks at it carefully. Perhaps it has changed color. Perhaps it has a surface that seems unusual. But the family has little else. The meat is cooked. The pot begins to simmer. The smell of smoke mixes with the smell of broth. Hours later, everyone eats. Nothing about the meal looks dramatic. The danger, if there is one, is invisible. And that is one reason food history requires patience. We cannot assume that every illness following a meal was caused by food. Medieval people became sick for many reasons. Infections, parasites, contaminated water, chronic disease, injuries, and many other conditions were part of life. Historical evidence rarely allows us to look at a particular medieval illness and confidently say, this was caused by that meal. Sometimes evidence does exist. Often, it does not. So when we explore dangerous food practices, we must distinguish between what is historically documented and what is scientifically plausible. That distinction will remain important throughout our journey. We will not imagine that every strange medieval dish was poisonous. We will not turn every moldy loaf into a deadly weapon, and we will not assume that medieval people were ignorant. Instead, we will quietly examine the situations in which ordinary food practices could become dangerous. Sometimes the danger came from contamination, sometimes from poor storage, sometimes from confusion between plants, sometimes from unsafe water, sometimes from the way food was prepared, and sometimes from the simple fact that preservation has limits. As the morning slowly arrives in our imagined medieval town, the market becomes louder. But inside a nearby house, another part of the food story is unfolding. Someone is preparing bread. Bread was central to many European diets. For many people, grain was one of the most important sources of calories. Different regions depended on different grains. Wheat was prized in many places, while rye, barley, oats, millet, and other grains were important in various regions. The kind of bread someone ate could reveal something about their social position and local environment. Fine white wheat bread was often associated with greater wealth. Coarser breads made from other grains were more common among poorer households in many areas. But grain quality mattered regardless of status. A harvest affected everyone, and grain could suffer from a quiet enemy: fungus. One particularly important historical example involves ergot, a fungus that can grow on rye and some related grasses under suitable conditions. Ergot contamination became associated with serious illness in parts of Europe. The condition known historically as ergotism could produce severe symptoms. In some outbreaks, people experienced burning sensations, pain, spasms, hallucinations, and other disturbing effects. Historical records from certain European regions describe episodes that have been interpreted as ergotism. But we should be careful. Not every medieval report of strange illness was caused by ergot. The exact causes of many historical outbreaks remain debated. Still, the relationship between contaminated grain and illness is well established scientifically, and ergot is an important reminder that danger could exist inside an ordinary-looking staple. Imagine a farmer looking over a field. The rye stands in the wind. The stalks move gently. Nothing about the scene announces danger. A person does not see bacteria moving through the grain. They do not see microscopic toxins. They see a harvest. They see bread. And this is the quiet difficulty of food safety. The things that harm us are not always the things that look frightening. A poisonous mushroom may look ordinary. A contaminated drink may look clean. A spoiled ingredient may smell only slightly different. A grain may carry something dangerous without announcing it. Medieval people therefore lived with uncertainty, yet they also developed habits that reduced some risks. Cooking food thoroughly could reduce certain biological dangers. Drying and salting could extend storage. Fermentation could create stable products. Boiling water or preparing beverages from heated or fermented liquids could sometimes alter exposure to contaminants, although we should not project modern germ theory onto these practices. People were solving practical problems without understanding all the science behind them. That is a recurring theme. Human beings often discover useful methods before they understand why those methods work. A medieval baker did not need to know the chemistry of fermentation to understand that yeast could transform dough. A cheesemaker did not need microbiology to understand that milk could become cheese. A brewer did not need to see microorganisms to know that grain could become a drink. Knowledge was built through observation, generation after generation, trial and error, memory, tradition, and sometimes painful experience. As we move deeper into the medieval kitchen, the smell of bread gives way to something richer. A pot of broth, perhaps onions, perhaps leeks, perhaps beans or peas, perhaps herbs. If the household has enough resources, there may be meat. The medieval pot was often a practical solution to the problem of feeding people. Ingredients could be combined. Tougher cuts could be softened through long cooking. Grains or legumes could add bulk. Vegetables could provide variety. A single pot could feed several people. And because the ingredients were cooked together, the meal could be economical. But the safety of the meal depended on what went into the pot. This brings us to one of the most important mistakes people could make: using food that was no longer safe simply because cooking seemed capable of fixing it. Heat can destroy many microorganisms, but cooking is not a magical reset button. Some toxins can survive conditions that kill the organisms that produced them. Medieval people did not have the scientific vocabulary to explain this. They simply knew that cooking changed food. Sometimes that was enough. Sometimes it was not. This is why the idea that they cooked everything so they were safe is too simple. Cooking helped. It could reduce certain risks, but it could not guarantee safety in every circumstance. The same is true today. Food safety begins before the pot reaches the fire. It begins with the condition of the ingredients. It continues through storage, preparation, cooking, and serving. Medieval households had their own version of this chain, even though they did not describe it in modern terms, and each link could fail. Perhaps the meat had been exposed to heat. Perhaps a container had become dirty. Perhaps water had been contaminated. Perhaps an ingredient had been mistaken for another. Perhaps insects had reached the grain. Perhaps the preservation process had failed. A single mistake did not always cause illness, but several problems together could increase the risk. This becomes especially important when we consider water. In medieval towns and villages, access to clean water varied greatly. Some communities had wells. Others depended on rivers, springs, cisterns, or other sources. Water could be affected by animals, waste, flooding, or nearby human activity. But we should avoid the simplistic claim that all medieval drinking water was filthy. That is not supported by the evidence. Many people understood that certain water sources were preferable to others. They selected springs. They protected wells. They used local knowledge. They avoided water that looked or smelled bad. The quality of water differed from place to place. Still, contamination could occur. Imagine a village after heavy rain. The ground has become soft. Water runs through paths and fields. Animals have moved through the mud. Waste lies near homes. A nearby water source may receive runoff. The water might still look clear, but the invisible contamination is another matter. A person fills a wooden vessel. The water is carried home. It may be used for drinking. It may be added to food. It may be used to wash ingredients. And once again, the danger is not necessarily visible. This is why medieval food history cannot be separated from sanitation. The kitchen and the environment were connected. The place where food was prepared was connected to the place where water was collected. The place where animals were kept could be close to the household. Waste disposal varied widely. Urban density could create different challenges from rural life. Seasonal weather could change conditions. Everything was connected. And yet, despite these dangers, medieval people ate every day. They raised animals. They baked bread. They brewed drinks. They made cheese. They dried fruit. They preserved fish. They harvested herbs. They cooked vegetables. They shared meals. They celebrated with food. They fasted for religious reasons. They traded food in markets. They transported food between regions. Food was not a side story in medieval life. Food was the center of it. So as the day moves forward, let us remain inside this world. The fire continues to burn. The wooden spoon moves slowly through the pot. Outside, the sounds of the settlement rise and fall. And somewhere nearby, a household is making a decision that seems completely ordinary. They have a piece of food. They must decide what to do with it. Perhaps they will preserve it. Perhaps they will cook it. Perhaps they will save it for tomorrow. That decision, repeated countless times across centuries, shaped the daily experience of medieval life. And sometimes, a small mistake in that decision could have consequences no one could see coming. The story continues quietly from there, because the most dangerous medieval food mistakes were not always made through recklessness. Often, they began with necessity. And necessity, more than anything else, shaped what people were willing to eat. The story continues with the same quiet household. The fire has been burning for some time now. The morning light has reached the doorway, and the darkness inside the room has softened into a gentle gray. The smell of cooked grain hangs in the air. A wooden bowl rests beside the hearth. Somewhere outside, a cart moves slowly over an uneven road. Nothing seems unusual. And yet, food in the medieval world was always moving through a delicate balance. Freshness became storage. Storage became preservation. Preservation eventually became a meal. Every step mattered. For people living without modern refrigeration, one of the greatest challenges was simply making food survive from one season to another. Imagine the end of autumn. The fields have become quieter. The harvest is mostly gathered. Leaves have begun to fall. The mornings are colder. The household looks toward the stores. There are sacks of grain. There may be dried peas and beans. There may be onions, roots, apples, nuts, cheese, salted meat, dried fish, or other preserved foods depending on the region and the wealth of the household. These supplies represent months of work. They must last. A mistake in storage could therefore become a slow disaster. One of the enemies was moisture. Grain needs to remain sufficiently dry during storage. Too much moisture can encourage mold and spoilage. Medieval farmers and householders knew through experience that damp grain was troublesome, even though they did not understand fungal growth in modern scientific terms. A storage room might be carefully chosen. A cellar could provide cool conditions for some foods. A raised granary could help protect grain from damp ground. Containers could keep some supplies away from animals and moisture. But buildings were not perfect. Rain could enter. Roofs could leak. Flooding could occur. Condensation and dampness could affect storage areas. And a single unnoticed problem could spread through a supply. Picture yourself opening a grain store on a cold morning. The wooden door creaks. Inside, the air smells different from the fresh outdoor air. You run your hand through a pile of grain. At first, everything appears normal. But perhaps some of it has begun to change. There may be clumps. There may be an unusual smell. There may be discoloration. What do you do? A wealthy household might have more choices. A poor household might have fewer. This difference is essential. Food safety was never only about knowledge. It was also about resources. If you had enough grain, you could discard damaged portions. If you had very little, the decision became harder. If an animal was ill, a wealthy household might have other sources of protein. A poor household might be reluctant to lose valuable meat. If milk spoiled, a family with several animals might have alternatives. A family with one animal might not. In this way, poverty could increase the pressure to use food that was less than ideal. But we should also remember that medieval people were skilled at making the most of limited resources. They did not automatically consider every change in food, to mean that it was dangerous. Some changes were useful. Fermentation is an obvious example. Fermented foods and drinks were widespread in many medieval societies. Fermentation could preserve food, change its flavor, and create products that could be stored for longer periods. Bread itself depended on fermentation. Beer and other fermented drinks were important in many parts of medieval Europe. Wine was central in regions where grapes could be cultivated. Fermented dairy products were also important. These processes were not mistakes. They were technologies. They were ways of controlling food through natural transformation. But fermentation required knowledge. A person had to recognize what a successful product looked and smelled like. A spoiled product could be different. The difference was sometimes obvious. Sometimes it was not. Imagine a medieval household preparing a batch of fermented food. The vessel is cleaned as well as local practice requires. The ingredients are prepared. The mixture is placed inside. Time passes. The household waits. There is no laboratory, no digital display, no written temperature chart. Instead, experience tells the maker when something is ready. Perhaps the smell is right. Perhaps the texture has changed as expected. Perhaps the color is familiar. Perhaps the taste confirms it. This knowledge could be remarkably sophisticated even without modern science. But it was not foolproof. The medieval world contained countless varieties of local food practices, and some were safer than others. One of the most important examples of preservation was salting. Salt was valuable. It could be used to preserve meat and fish, and was an important commodity in many regions. When meat was salted properly, the salt helped reduce available moisture and made the environment less favorable for many microorganisms. But salting did not make meat immortal. It slowed deterioration. It changed the food. It bought time. And the amount and method of salting mattered. Imagine a household preparing meat for winter. The animal has been slaughtered. The work is physical and careful. The meat is divided. Salt is applied. The pieces are arranged for storage. The household knows that this food must last. Days become weeks. The preserved meat is inspected. It may smell strongly of salt. It may feel different from fresh meat. But perhaps a portion was not adequately preserved. Perhaps the salt did not reach every part. Perhaps storage conditions became warmer or wetter than expected. The preservation process could fail. This is where one of the most common misunderstandings about historical food appears. Preserved does not mean permanently safe. Salted meat can still spoil. Smoked meat can still spoil. Dried food can still deteriorate. Fermented food can still go wrong. The medieval household was therefore not simply preserving food once and forgetting about it. Storage required attention. Food had to be checked. Supplies had to be rotated. Older food was often used before newer supplies, and people relied heavily on smell, appearance, and experience. This careful attention was one reason many preserved foods could be used successfully. But another danger waited in the pantry: pests. Mice and rats could reach stored grain and other foods. Insects could infest cereals. Flies could reach exposed food. Animals were part of the medieval environment, and keeping them away from food was a constant challenge. A grain store might be protected by physical barriers. Containers could help. Raised storage could help. Cats could be kept around households and stores, particularly in places where they were useful for controlling rodents. But no method was perfect. A small opening was enough. A damaged container was enough. A careless moment was enough. Imagine hearing scratching in the wall during the night. The household is quiet. The fire is almost gone out. The sound comes again. A small animal is moving somewhere near the food stores. For a modern listener, the scene might feel almost harmless. But to a medieval household, rodents could threaten precious supplies. They could consume food. They could contaminate it. They could damage containers. And they could contribute to the spread of disease. Still, we should be careful not to imagine medieval homes as constantly crawling with rats. Conditions differed enormously. Some buildings were cleaner and better maintained than others. Some storage areas were carefully managed. Some settlements had regulations concerning waste and animals. The reality was varied. The danger came from the possibility, not from an inevitable condition. The same is true of flies. During warm months, insects could be abundant. A bowl of food left uncovered could attract them. A market stall could be exposed to them. Meat could be vulnerable. Fish could be vulnerable. Milk could be vulnerable. The household had to protect food as best it could. This brings us to another important feature of medieval cooking. Food was often prepared close to the moment it would be eaten. This did not eliminate danger, but it reduced the time during which certain foods remained exposed. Meals could be cooked in large quantities, especially where many people needed to be fed. Castles, monasteries, large households, and institutions might prepare considerable amounts of food. In such environments, organization mattered. Food had to be purchased, stored, prepared, cooked, served, and distributed. A large kitchen could therefore be a highly organized place. Imagine entering one. The sound is different from the quiet family kitchen. There are more voices, more movement. Knives striking boards, pots shifting, fire crackling, water being carried, bread being handled. The smell of onions and herbs mixes with smoke. Large households needed people who understood food. Cooks were not merely servants who threw ingredients into pots. They needed practical knowledge. They had to manage quantities. They had to understand cooking times. They had to work with available ingredients. They had to preserve food. They had to serve meals according to social expectations. And in some households, they had to prepare food for dozens or even hundreds of people. The larger the household, the more complicated the system became. A mistake could affect many people. Yet large kitchens also had advantages. They could have dedicated storage spaces. They could have more workers. They could have access to better ingredients. They could have more fuel. They could prepare food under more controlled conditions. So again, medieval food safety cannot be reduced to a simple story of ignorance. The real story is more subtle. People had systems. Those systems worked often enough to sustain communities for generations, but they were vulnerable. Now imagine a different setting, a small roadside inn. Travelers have arrived after a long day. Their clothes are dusty. Their boots are damp. The evening air has become cool. Inside there is warmth from the fire. The smell of cooked food fills the room. Travelers need a meal. They may be hungry enough to eat quickly. An innkeeper has a responsibility to feed them. But food in an inn could come from different sources. Some ingredients may be purchased locally. Others may have been stored. Some may have been prepared earlier. The quality depended on the establishment and the circumstances. It would be unfair to say that medieval inns routinely served dangerous food. Many travelers depended on inns and other lodging places. But feeding travelers created practical challenges. Food had to be available at predictable times. It had to be affordable. It had to be stored. And it had to be prepared for people whose bodies and previous diets were unknown. A traveler might arrive from another region. They might eat foods they were not accustomed to. They might drink unfamiliar water. They might already be ill. If they became sick after a meal, it would not always be possible to identify the cause. This uncertainty is another reason historical food stories must be handled carefully. The presence of illness after eating does not automatically prove food poisoning. Medieval people lived in a world where many illnesses circulated. Still, food and water could certainly contribute to illness. And sometimes the evidence comes from legal records, medical writings, household accounts, or other documents. These sources give us glimpses into the concerns of medieval society. Medical writers discussed digestion. They described foods according to the medical theories of their time. They sometimes recommended particular foods for particular conditions. Their explanations were based on the medical traditions available to them, especially ideas inherited from ancient Greek and Roman medicine. These theories are not the same as modern medicine, yet they reveal something valuable. Medieval people paid close attention to how food affected the body. They noticed that some foods were easier to digest than others. They noticed that certain foods could cause discomfort. They noticed seasonal differences. They considered preparation important. They had theories about balance, digestion, and bodily health. The theories were often wrong by modern scientific standards, but the observation itself was real. People were constantly learning from experience. Now let us return to one of the quietest dangers in the medieval kitchen. Plants. The medieval landscape provided food. It also provided medicine. Herbs grew in gardens and wild places. People gathered plants for cooking. They used plants to flavor food. They used them for remedies. They used them for dyes and other purposes. But some plants could be poisonous. And identifying plants correctly required knowledge. Imagine walking along a woodland edge. The ground is damp from recent rain. Leaves shine softly. Birds move among the branches. You find a plant that looks familiar. Perhaps it resembles something edible. Perhaps someone told you that it could be used. You gather it. There is no modern field guide in your pocket. No smartphone photograph to compare. No laboratory identification. Knowledge is carried in memory. The danger of plant confusion was real. Some poisonous plants resemble edible species. Others become dangerous when prepared incorrectly. Some parts of a plant may be edible, while others are toxic. Some plants have medicinal uses, but can cause harm when taken in excessive quantities. Medieval herbal knowledge was extensive in some traditions. Monasteries and learned communities preserved and developed botanical knowledge. Local people also possessed practical knowledge that never entered written texts. But no knowledge system was perfect. A mistake in identification could be serious. This is one area where the phrase deadly mistake deserves careful attention. We cannot assume that every historical poisoning came from accidental plant confusion. Many cases are impossible to reconstruct, but the potential danger was genuine. The medieval landscape contained both food and poison, and sometimes they grew surprisingly close together. The same principle applied to mushrooms. Mushrooms could be valuable food, but some species are poisonous. Correct identification requires knowledge. A mistake can cause severe illness or death. Modern mushroom experts still warn about the dangers of misidentification. For medieval gatherers, the problem was even harder. Knowledge was local. Different regions had different species. People relied on experience. Some communities developed strong traditions around edible mushrooms. Others may have been more cautious. The important point is not that medieval people randomly ate unknown mushrooms. Most people who gathered food regularly had practical knowledge. The danger appeared when knowledge failed. Perhaps someone was inexperienced. Perhaps an unfamiliar species appeared. Perhaps a child gathered something. Perhaps a plant was confused with another. The mistake could happen quickly. And food gathering was not limited to plants. People also relied on wild animals, fish, birds, and other sources of food. Each carried its own risks. Fish could spoil quickly in warm conditions. Meat could deteriorate. Shellfish could sometimes be dangerous, depending on species and environmental conditions. People who lived close to rivers, lakes, or the sea developed local knowledge about seasons and availability. Again, experience was the main guide. The medieval world was a world of local ecological knowledge. A fisher knew the water. A farmer knew the field. A shepherd knew the animals. A gatherer knew the plants. A baker knew the dough. A brewer knew the fermenting vessel. A cheesemaker knew the milk. This knowledge made survival possible. But survival knowledge was not the same as scientific certainty. It was practical, flexible, and sometimes incomplete. As evening approaches in our imagined settlement, the temperature begins to fall. The road becomes quieter. Smoke rises from rooftops. Inside the houses, families gather around their meals. A simple bowl can contain an entire history. The grain came from a field. The field depended on weather. The harvest depended on labor. The grain had to be dried. It had to be stored. It had to be protected from pests. It had to be milled. The flour had to be mixed. The dough had to rise. The bread had to be baked. And finally, someone had to decide whether it was still good enough to eat. That final decision seems small, but multiplied across millions of meals and generations, these decisions shaped medieval survival. There is another mistake worth considering: eating food simply because it was expensive or difficult to obtain. This might sound strange, but social status influenced food choices. Certain foods carried prestige. Spices were especially associated with wealth and long-distance trade. Pepper, cinnamon, cloves, ginger, and other spices could travel enormous distances before reaching European consumers. They were valuable. They could make ordinary food more interesting. They could also be associated with medical ideas and elite cuisine. But spices did not make spoiled food safe. Their strong flavors could alter the taste of a dish. Yet it would be wrong to assume that medieval cooks used spices simply to hide rotten meat. That popular image has little basis as a general explanation. Spices were expensive commodities. They were valued for flavor, status, medicine, and culinary tradition. A cook would not necessarily waste them on food that had clearly spoiled. This is another example of why medieval food history needs careful interpretation. Stories about the past can become exaggerated. A colorful claim is sometimes repeated until it sounds like a fact. But the reality is usually more interesting. Medieval cooks were skilled. They knew how to make food taste good. They used herbs and spices because they enjoyed flavor and because food culture mattered. They also faced genuine preservation problems. Both things could be true. Now consider bread again. Bread was so important that its quality could become a matter of public concern. Urban authorities sometimes regulated bread making, weights, prices, or the quality of ingredients. The exact rules varied. But the existence of such regulations tells us that bread was economically and socially important. A baker who produced underweight loaves could face trouble. A baker who used poor quality grain might damage their reputation. A baker depended on customers returning. Trust mattered. The same was true of other food sellers. Markets function only when people have some confidence in what they are buying. That confidence was not always justified. Fraud existed. Adulteration existed. People sometimes attempted to increase profits by manipulating goods. But again, the exact practices varied by time and place. It is tempting to imagine medieval markets as places where every seller was dishonest. That would be just as inaccurate as imagining every seller was perfectly honest. Human behavior was mixed then, just as it is now. Some people cheated, some did not. Some authorities enforced rules. Some failed. Some consumers were careful. Others were not. And sometimes, even honest people made mistakes. A merchant could transport food safely and still encounter unexpected spoilage. A farmer could store grain properly and still lose part of a harvest. A cook could prepare a meal carefully and still use an ingredient that had deteriorated. History is rarely divided into villains and victims. Often, it is simply people trying to manage uncertainty. As night settles over the medieval settlement, the kitchen fire becomes the brightest source of light. The meal is finished. Bowls are emptied. The smell of smoke remains in the room. Someone carries away the cooking vessel. Another person checks the remaining food. Perhaps there is enough for tomorrow. Perhaps there is not. And this quiet act of saving leftovers leads us to another important question. How long could food be safely kept? The answer depended on the food, the temperature, the preparation, and the storage conditions. There was no single rule. Cold weather could slow deterioration. Warm weather could accelerate it. Dry food could last much longer than moist food. Salted food could last longer than fresh meat. Fermented products could be stable under suitable conditions. But leftovers were still leftovers. A household had to judge them. This was especially important in warm seasons. Imagine a summer evening. The air is heavy. The kitchen is warm from the fire. A large pot of food remains after the meal. The family does not want to waste it. The pot may be covered. Perhaps it is moved to a cooler area. But without refrigeration, the food remains vulnerable. If the next meal is soon, it may be eaten. If it sits for too long, the risk increases. Medieval households had no modern way to measure this risk precisely. They depended on experience. That experience could be good. It could also fail. And so, the medieval kitchen becomes a place where preservation, necessity, knowledge, and uncertainty meet. The people inside are not careless. They are doing what generations before them taught them to do. They inspect, they smell, they taste, they cook, they preserve, they store, they remember, and they hope. The fire slowly burns lower. Outside, the night wind moves through the streets. The day has ended, but the food story has not. Because some of the most interesting dangers were hidden not in the food itself, but in the habits surrounding it. Where food was stored, how vessels were cleaned, where water came from, how animals were handled, how leftovers were treated, and how quickly people recognized when something had gone wrong. Tomorrow, the same household will wake again. The same grain will be measured. The same hearth will be lit. The same wooden bowls will be used. And once again, someone will stand before the food stores and make a small decision. A decision that may seem insignificant. But in the medieval world, small decisions often carried the weight of survival. And with the first pale light of another morning, we can follow that decision further into the quiet world of medieval food. The first light of morning returns slowly. The fire has gone cold during the night, leaving only a little gray ash beneath the cooking pot. Outside, the air is cool. A few birds are beginning to call from rooftops and trees. Inside the house, someone wakes. There is work to do. Food must be prepared again. The quiet rhythm of the household begins another day. Yesterday, we followed food from the fields and storage rooms into kitchens and markets. We saw how medieval people preserved food, protected grain, handled milk, prepared meat, and relied upon experience to decide whether something remained usable. Now we can look more closely at one of the most important parts of that world, the relationship between food and water. For a medieval household, water was needed for almost everything. People drank it. They cooked with it. They washed their hands and utensils with it. They washed vegetables. They cleaned food preparation areas. Animals drank it. Brewers and other food producers needed large quantities of it. Water was therefore woven into nearly every part of daily life. And because water was so important, its source mattered. Imagine walking through a medieval settlement in the early morning. The road is still quiet. The ground may be damp with dew. You carry a wooden bucket. Perhaps you are heading toward a well. The well is not merely a hole in the ground. It is part of the community. People come there regularly. They collect water. They talk. They exchange news. Children may pass nearby. Animals may also be present. The quality of the water depends partly on the environment around it. If the well is protected and carefully maintained, it may provide useful water for a long time. If waste enters the area, the situation can change. This is why medieval communities sometimes established rules concerning wells, waste, animals, drainage, and other aspects of urban life. People understood that some sources were better than others. They did not understand microorganisms in the modern sense, but they could observe patterns. A particular well might have a bad reputation. A stream might be avoided after heavy rain. A spring might be considered especially good. Local knowledge could be remarkably practical. Still, local knowledge had limits. Water that looked clear could still carry harmful organisms. Water that tasted normal could still make someone sick. This invisible danger is one of the greatest differences between the medieval world and the modern one. Today, we can test water. Medieval people could not. They had to judge it through experience and observation. This did not mean they were helpless. They had several ways of reducing risk. Water could be heated during cooking. Fermented drinks were widely consumed in many parts of Europe. Boiling was known as a method of purification, although it was not necessarily practiced specifically because of an understanding of microorganisms. But we should be careful with a popular claim. It is often said that medieval people drank beer because water was too dangerous. The reality is much more complicated. People drank water. They also drank fermented beverages. Beer and ale were important in many regions, while wine was central in others. Alcoholic drinks could be nutritious and culturally important. They were not simply substitutes for dirty water. Different communities had different drinking habits. Some people consumed large amounts of weak alcoholic beverages. Others drank water. Children also drank non-alcoholic beverages and water. The medieval drinking world was varied, and that variety reminds us that history rarely fits into a single sentence. Now imagine a medieval baker beginning work. The flour has been stored overnight. The baker touches it. It feels dry. The smell is familiar. The flour is mixed with water. The dough begins to form. Hands press and fold it. The room smells of grain. The dough rests. Hours later, the bread is ready. This simple process contains another important issue. Grain could be contaminated before it ever became flour. Poor storage could introduce mold. Pests could damage it. Dampness could change its condition. Some contaminants were visible. Others were not. The baker had to work with what was available. If the grain was poor, the final bread would reflect it. In some cases, medieval people sifted flour. The process could remove some unwanted material. Milling and sieving changed the texture of flour and affected what remained in it. But these processes were not designed with modern food safety standards in mind. They were primarily part of producing usable flour and bread. Even so, they could remove some impurities. The medieval loaf was therefore the result of many stages of human judgment, from field to mill, from mill to bakery, from bakery to table. At every stage, there were opportunities for mistakes. One of the most serious dangers in the medieval diet came not from strange exotic foods, but from ordinary staples: grain, milk, meat, fish, water. These were foods people depended on, and because they were eaten so often, even a relatively uncommon problem could affect many people. Consider meat. Meat was highly valued, but access varied greatly according to wealth, region, season, and occupation. Some medieval people ate meat regularly. Others ate much less. Religious fasting practices could also restrict the consumption of certain animal products on particular days or seasons. This meant that meat preservation was important. An animal could provide a large amount of food. It was not always practical to eat everything immediately. Preservation extended its usefulness. Salt, smoke, drying, cold weather. Different combinations of these methods could help. But there was another challenge. Slaughter. The condition of the animal mattered. Medieval people had practical knowledge about animals. Farmers and butchers were accustomed to observing livestock. They could notice obvious signs of illness. But not every disease or contamination was visible. This is where modern food safety has an enormous advantage. We can identify pathogens that medieval people could not see. We can control temperatures. We can separate raw and cooked food. We can use sanitation procedures. We can test products. Medieval households had none of these modern systems in their full form. They relied on observation and custom. Imagine a butcher working in a medieval town. The day begins early. The street is cold. The smell of animals and smoke fills the air. The work is demanding. Meat must be cut. Waste must be managed. Customers wait. The butcher needs to keep the work area as orderly as possible. Depending on the town and period, regulations could govern where butchers worked and how waste was handled. Authorities sometimes tried to keep certain trades in designated areas or away from sensitive places. Such rules were not always perfectly enforced, but they show that medieval communities recognized environmental and public concerns. Food production was not completely unregulated. Still, the distance between a rule and actual practice could be considerable. A town could have regulations and still have dirty streets. A market could have standards and still contain spoiled food. A household could have careful habits and still suffer illness. This is not a contradiction. It is simply the reality of human systems. Now picture a medieval fish market. The morning is brighter. The smell is stronger. Fish are displayed for customers. Near the coast, fish may be plentiful. Farther inland, preserved fish can become an important commodity. Salted fish can travel. Dried fish can travel. Preservation turns a fragile food into a trade good. This was economically important. But fish spoil quickly when fresh. Warm conditions can make the problem worse. A fish that was excellent in the morning might be far less desirable later if it was not kept appropriately. Medieval people understood this through experience. Fish markets could therefore be active places where timing mattered. Catch, transport, sell, cook, eat. The chain had to move, and once again, food safety depended on time. Time is one of the quietest forces in food history. A food does not have to be poisonous when it is first prepared. It can become dangerous later. A storage method does not have to fail immediately. It can fail gradually. A container does not have to be contaminated forever. It can become contaminated at some point. The medieval household therefore lived with a constant awareness of change. A food that was safe yesterday might not be safe today. A drink that tasted normal might become sour. A cheese might develop an unfamiliar appearance. A loaf might become hard. Fruit might soften. Meat might change color. Some changes were harmless. Some were useful. Some were signs of spoilage. The difficult part was knowing which was which. This brings us to leftovers. Leftovers were not necessarily regarded as something unpleasant. They were valuable. A household that had spent time and resources preparing food did not want to waste it. Cooked food could be reused. Meat could be incorporated into another dish. Bread could be transformed into other preparations. Older ingredients could be combined with fresh ones. Soups and stews were practical ways to use available supplies. But reusing food required judgment. If a food had been stored poorly, cooking it again might not remove every danger. And if it had been left in a warm environment for too long, the risk could increase. Medieval people did not know about bacterial growth, but they did know that food could become bad. They had words for bad smells. They had ways of describing spoiled food. They had habits of inspection. The science was missing. The observation was not. Imagine an elderly woman in a medieval household. She has spent decades preparing food. She knows the smell of fresh milk. She knows the smell of sour milk. She knows the difference between bread that is merely stale and bread that has become unpleasant. She knows which herbs belong in a particular dish. She knows how much salt is needed. Her knowledge may never be written in a book, but it is still knowledge. This kind of domestic expertise was essential. Much of medieval food knowledge was transmitted through practice. A child watched an older relative. A young apprentice watched a master. A farm worker learned from experience. A cook learned by repetition. Knowledge moved through hands. This is easy to overlook when we read history from surviving written documents. Written sources tend to preserve the concerns of literate people. But most food preparation happened in kitchens, farms, workshops, and homes. The knowledge of ordinary people often remained oral. That knowledge could be extremely detailed, and it helped households avoid many dangers. Still, mistakes happened. One of the most troubling mistakes involved confusing similar plants. The medieval countryside offered many edible species. It also offered poisonous ones. Some plants had similar leaves. Some had similar roots. Some could be confused when young. A person who had learned from an experienced gatherer might recognize the difference immediately. Someone inexperienced might not. Imagine a spring morning. The fields are green. Young plants are appearing. A person gathers herbs for the kitchen. The basket fills slowly. The plants are brought home. They are washed. They are chopped. They enter a pot. No one suspects a problem. This is why plant poisoning can be so frightening. The mistake may happen long before the food is served. The final meal can look completely ordinary. There is no dramatic warning. Only later does illness appear. Historical accounts of poisoning sometimes describe severe symptoms, but identifying the exact plant responsible centuries later can be difficult. Names change. Descriptions are incomplete. Different plants may have been known by similar names, so historians must be cautious. We can identify known poisonous species and understand their effects scientifically, but we cannot confidently assign every medieval poisoning story to a specific plant. What we can say is that the risk existed. The landscape itself contained both medicine and poison. This was especially important because medieval medicine made extensive use of plants. A plant could be useful in one preparation and dangerous in another. Dose mattered. Part of the plant mattered. Preparation mattered. Individual health mattered. And knowledge mattered. The same herb could be considered beneficial by a medieval medical tradition, while modern science might recognize both active compounds and potential toxicity. Again, we should not laugh at this knowledge. People were working without modern chemistry. They observed effects. They recorded recipes. They developed traditions. Some treatments were ineffective. Some may have been harmful. Others contained ingredients that genuinely have pharmacological effects. The history of food and medicine therefore overlaps. A kitchen could contain herbs used both for flavor and for healing. A garden could be part pantry and part pharmacy. And a mistake could cross the boundary between nourishment and harm. There was another danger that came from animals. Milk was usually obtained from cows, goats, sheep, or other animals depending on region. Fresh milk was nutritious. It was also perishable. Milking required contact between animal, container, hands, and environment. The cleanliness of the process mattered. Modern dairy hygiene is built around controlling contamination. Medieval dairy production depended on practical cleanliness and rapid use or preservation. Milk could be transformed into butter, cheese, or other products. These processes made it possible to preserve nutrition, but contamination could still occur. Imagine a dairy worker at dawn. The animal is brought into position. The air is cold. The milking vessel is ready. The milk is warm. Steam may rise slightly in the morning air. It looks clean. It smells fresh. The milk is carried indoors. It may be consumed soon, or it may be turned into cheese. The process seems simple. But microorganisms do not announce themselves. This invisible world existed in the medieval kitchen just as it exists today. The people simply could not see it. That is one of the central lessons of medieval food history. The absence of scientific knowledge did not mean the absence of food safety behavior. People developed practical methods because they had to. But practical methods could never control every invisible hazard. Now let us travel to a monastery. The setting is quieter. Stone walls surround the community. A bell has marked the rhythm of the day. In the kitchen, food is being prepared for the members of the religious house. Monasteries were important centers of food production and preservation in medieval Europe. Some had gardens. Some had orchards. Some kept livestock. Some maintained fish ponds. They could possess extensive storage facilities. They also produced or received records concerning food supplies. A monastery might have a more organized food system than a small household. But organization did not eliminate risk. Stored grain could still become damaged. Fruit could still rot. Cheese could still spoil. Water could still become contaminated. The difference was that institutions often had more resources and more people dedicated to managing food. Food could be accounted for. Supplies could be measured. Storage could be supervised. Large kitchens required planning. This tells us something important about medieval society. Food preservation was not merely a household trick. It was an economic system. It supported armies, monasteries, castles, towns, ships, Markets. Long-distance trade. Without preservation, many forms of medieval life would have been impossible. Salted fish could travel. Dried grains could travel. Cheese could travel. Wine could travel. Beer could travel. Spices could travel. Preservation extended the distance between producer and consumer. But distance introduced another problem. Time. A food traveling several days or weeks faced changing conditions. Temperature changed. Containers could break. Moisture could enter. Animals could reach supplies. Transport could be delayed by weather. Roads could become muddy. Rivers could flood. Ships could be delayed by wind. A product that left its origin in good condition might arrive in a different state. Imagine a merchant ship carrying barrels. The sea is restless. The vessel moves slowly. Inside the hold are supplies. Barrels are stacked. The air smells of wood, salt, and damp rope. The food must survive the journey. The merchants have invested money. The crew needs to eat. The cargo must reach its destination. Preservation is therefore not simply about keeping food edible. It is about making movement possible. Trade itself depends upon it. And every journey introduces uncertainty. This is why salt became so important. Salt could be produced in coastal areas and transported inland. It was valuable enough to become a major commodity. Different regions developed different methods of salt production. Salt was used not only for preserving food, but also in other crafts and economic activities. Its importance went far beyond the kitchen. For fishers and merchants, salt could make the difference between a catch that had to be eaten quickly and a product that could be sold far away. For households, it could extend the usefulness of meat. For communities, it could support trade. Yet salt itself had limits. Too little might not preserve effectively. Too much could make food difficult to eat. Preservation had to balance safety, taste, cost, and availability. This balance was part of everyday medieval knowledge. Now imagine winter. Snow lies outside. The roads are quieter. The kitchen is warm. The household opens its stores. A preserved piece of meat is brought out. Dried peas are measured. Grain is ground. The meal begins. Winter was not necessarily a season of constant hunger, but it could place pressure on food supplies. The ability to preserve food from autumn was therefore crucial. If a household had planned well, winter could be manageable. If stores were damaged, the situation could become difficult. And when supplies were low, people might make different choices. They might use food that was older. They might stretch meals with more grain or legumes. They might rely on preserved foods. They might substitute one ingredient for another. Necessity shaped the menu. This is another reason why some food practices that seem strange today made sense in their original context. People were not always trying to create exotic meals. They were trying to feed themselves. A tough piece of meat could become part of a stew. Stale bread could become an ingredient rather than waste. Sour milk could be transformed into another dairy product when the process was controlled. Vegetable scraps could be used in broths. Animal fats could be rendered and stored. Food culture developed around making resources last. Waste was expensive, and yet avoiding waste could sometimes create another danger. The desire to use everything could encourage people to consume food that should have been discarded. The balance was difficult. When food was plentiful, caution was easier. When food was scarce, caution could become a luxury. The medieval world, therefore, had two competing pressures. Preserve food so it lasts, but do not preserve it badly. Use food so nothing is wasted. But do not use food that has become unsafe. Cook food thoroughly, but do not assume cooking can solve every problem. Trust experience. But remember, that experience cannot see everything. These tensions existed quietly in everyday life. No dramatic music accompanied them. No warning appeared on a kitchen wall. A person simply had to decide, and then eat. As evening returns, the medieval household becomes quiet once again. The fire crackles softly. The smell of cooked grain lingers. A wooden cup rests beside the hearth. Outside, the wind moves through the narrow streets. The people inside do not know about bacteria. They do not know about modern toxicology. They do not know about foodborne pathogens. But they know hunger. They know waste. They know the value of a full storehouse. They know the difference between a fresh loaf and an old one. They know the smell of smoke on preserved meat. They know the taste of sour milk. They know which plants belong in the cooking pot. They know that some foods should be treated carefully. And they have learned these things through countless small observations. Sometimes those observations saved lives. Sometimes they failed. The most dangerous food mistakes of the medieval world were therefore rarely simple acts of foolishness. They were usually the result of uncertainty. A person could follow everything they had been taught and still encounter a hazard they could not see. A household could preserve food carefully and still lose a batch. A farmer could store grain properly and still face contamination. A cook could prepare a meal skillfully and still begin with a dangerous ingredient. A traveler could drink from a seemingly clean source and become ill. History gives us these possibilities, but it rarely gives us the complete story of every meal. That is why we must listen carefully to the evidence. And tomorrow, when the morning light returns once again, our journey will move deeper into the foods medieval people considered ordinary, the preservation methods they depended upon, and the subtle mistakes that could turn an everyday meal into something far more dangerous. For now, the household sleeps. The fire fades. The stored grain waits in darkness. The bread rests on its wooden board. And beyond the walls, the medieval night continues quietly. The night passes quietly. Before sunrise, the settlement is still. The wooden doors are closed. The streets are empty, except for the occasional movement of an early traveler. Inside the houses, yesterday's warmth has almost disappeared. Then, slowly, the first sounds of morning begin. A latch moves. Someone coughs softly. A fire is stirred back to life. Dry wood catches. A small flame appears. And once again, food becomes the center of the day. By now, we have seen that medieval people were not simply careless with what they ate. They had detailed knowledge of farming, preservation, cooking, and storage. They understood that food changed. They knew that some changes were useful. They knew that others meant food should be avoided. But there were still dangers that experience could not always reveal. Some of the most difficult mistakes occurred when a food looked perfectly ordinary. This morning, let us begin with something that could be found in almost every medieval household: bread. Bread was not merely another item on the table. For many people, it was a foundation of the diet. A loaf could be eaten with soup. It could accompany meat. It could be dipped into sauces. It could be carried during travel. It could be given to workers. It could be distributed as part of charity. And in some communities, bread was so important that its weight and price were matters of public concern. But bread began with grain. And grain had its own vulnerabilities. Imagine a medieval mill. The building stands near a source of moving water, or perhaps depends on another source of power. Inside, machinery moves. Wooden components turn. Grain passes through the milling process. The air is filled with the smell of crushed cereal. Fine particles drift through the light. The miller works with enormous amounts of grain. A good miller needs practical skill. The grain must be handled properly. The machinery must function. The flour must be produced in a useful form. The mill is an important part of the local food system. But a mill cannot transform poor grain into perfect grain. If the grain arrives damaged, the flour may reflect that damage. This is where storage becomes important again. Grain could be affected by insects, rodents, moisture, and fungal growth. Some problems were obvious, others were not. Ergot, for example, could affect rye and other grasses under certain conditions. The fungus produces alkaloids that can cause serious illness when contaminated grain is consumed. Historical outbreaks of ergotism occurred in parts of Europe, particularly where rye was an important staple. People experiencing ergotism could suffer from painful burning sensations, spasms, neurological symptoms, and other severe effects. Some historical accounts describe outbreaks in ways that suggest this condition, but the evidence does not allow us to label every medieval epidemic as ergotism. The important point is simpler. A common staple could carry an invisible danger. The field could look peaceful. The grain could look useful. The flour could become bread. And yet, contamination could travel from field to table. Imagine a farmer looking over the crop. The wind moves through the stalks. The sky is pale. There is no obvious warning. The harvest is gathered. The grain is stored. Months later, it becomes food. The danger, if present, may have begun long before anyone notices. This is one reason medieval food history is closely connected with agriculture. Food safety did not begin in the kitchen. It began in the field. Weather played a major role. Too much rain could damage crops. Poor harvests could create shortages. Drought could reduce yields. Cold weather could affect growing seasons. Wet conditions could influence fungal growth. Farmers had to respond to conditions they could not control. They watched the sky. They watched the soil. They watched their animals. They watched the crops. Their knowledge was built from generations of observation. Still, nature could surprise them. A successful harvest was never guaranteed. And when a harvest was poor, the pressure on food stores increased. This brings us to another quiet danger: famine. Famine is not simply a story about people having no food. It can also be a story about what happens when food becomes scarce enough that ordinary standards change. A household with full stores can afford to reject damaged food. A household facing hunger may not. This does not mean that hungry people simply ate anything. They still had knowledge. They still tried to distinguish useful food from harmful food. But necessity narrowed the choices. Imagine a winter when the harvest was poor. The grain store is smaller than expected. The weather has been difficult. There is little fresh produce. The family opens a container. Inside is grain that has been stored for months. Some of it is not perfect, but it is food. It represents calories. It represents survival. The grain is cleaned as carefully as possible. It is ground. It becomes porridge or bread. The household eats. This is not foolishness. It is a difficult calculation. The medieval poor often lived much closer to the edge of food insecurity than wealthy households. A failed harvest could have enormous consequences. And when food supplies became tight, people relied on substitutes. Different grains could be mixed. Legumes could provide additional nourishment. Roots and vegetables could stretch meals. Wild foods could supplement cultivated crops. This flexibility helped communities survive. But unfamiliar foods could also create risks. A plant that was edible in one preparation might be harmful in another. A plant gathered at the wrong stage might be difficult or dangerous. Local knowledge mattered, and knowledge could disappear when communities were disrupted. War, migration, disease, economic change, environmental disasters. All could interfere with traditional food systems. Now imagine a traveler arriving in an unfamiliar region. The landscape is different. The plants are different. The local foods are unfamiliar. A meal is placed before them. They trust the host. They eat. For the traveler, local knowledge is limited. This did not necessarily make travel dangerous in itself. People traveled constantly in the medieval world. Merchants crossed regions. Pilgrims traveled to religious sites. Students moved between centers of learning. Soldiers marched. Craft workers relocated. Food traditions traveled with them. But unfamiliar environments required adaptation. A traveler needed to understand which foods were common and how they were prepared. They needed to find reliable sources of water. They needed to choose lodging. They needed to preserve provisions during journeys. Travel itself changed food. Bread could become stale. Fresh meat was difficult to carry without preservation. Cheese and dried foods were useful. Salted fish could travel. Nuts and dried fruits could last. These were practical travel foods. A person setting out on a long journey needed food that could survive the road. Imagine a medieval road at midday. The sun is warm. Dust rises beneath the feet of travelers. A horse moves slowly. A small bag contains provisions. There is bread, perhaps dried meat, perhaps cheese, perhaps nuts or dried fruit. The food is simple. It is chosen because it can endure. But even durable foods require care. Moisture can damage them. Animals can reach them. Containers can break. Long journeys create opportunities for food to deteriorate, and travelers may have no alternative. The farther they travel, the more important preservation becomes. This is one reason medieval trade networks depended so heavily on foods that could be stored. Without preservation, long-distance commerce in food would have been much more difficult. Now, let us return to the household kitchen. A pot is hanging over the fire. Inside are vegetables, grain, and perhaps a piece of meat. The meal cooks slowly. Long cooking was useful for many reasons. It could soften ingredients. It could make tough cuts easier to eat. It could combine flavors. It could create a filling meal from modest ingredients. But again, we should not imagine that medieval people believed boiling made any food completely safe. They understood that cooking changed food, but their understanding was practical rather than microbiological. The idea that all dangers could simply be boiled away is a modern oversimplification. Some harmful substances can survive cooking. Some food may already have deteriorated before it reaches the pot, and contamination can occur after cooking. This last point is important. Food does not become automatically safe forever once it has been cooked. Imagine a large household preparing a meal. The food is cooked. It is placed in containers. People begin serving. Perhaps some of the cooked food is carried to another room. Perhaps some is kept for later. The longer it remains exposed, the more opportunities there are for contamination or deterioration. Medieval people had no modern system of temperature control. They had to use practical judgment. In colder weather, food could remain usable longer. In warmer weather, caution was more important. The environment itself became part of the preservation system. Winter cold could be helpful. Summer heat could be difficult. This seasonal difference shaped medieval cooking. In winter, certain foods could be kept naturally cool. In summer, preservation became more challenging. This is one reason seasonal food patterns were so important. People ate what the environment made available. They preserved what they could. They relied on stored supplies when fresh food was unavailable. And they adjusted their meals according to the season. Now consider one of the most familiar preserved foods: cheese. Cheese was a remarkable food technology. Milk is highly perishable. Cheese transforms it into a product that can often be stored much longer. Different regions developed different varieties. The methods varied. Some cheeses were soft, some were hard, some were salted, some were aged. The precise techniques depended on local traditions. Cheesemaking required experience. The maker had to understand milk. They had to know how to separate curds and whey. They had to manage salt. They had to control moisture. They had to know when the product was ready. A successful cheese could provide valuable nutrition during seasons when fresh milk was less available. But cheese could also spoil. Not every change was dangerous. Some molds and microorganisms are part of intentional cheese production. Others indicate unwanted contamination. This distinction is particularly difficult when looking backward. A modern person may see mold and assume danger, but some traditional cheeses deliberately use molds. Medieval cheesemakers had their own sensory understanding of which changes were acceptable. They did not classify microorganisms scientifically. They classified cheeses by experience. This was local expertise, and sometimes it was passed down for centuries. The same complexity existed with fermented drinks. Beer and ale were important beverages in many medieval communities. Brewing transformed grain into a drink that could be stored and transported. The brewing process involved heating, fermentation, and other stages. The finished drink could be weaker or stronger, depending on the recipe and region. Ale and beer were not identical everywhere. Methods changed over time. Ingredients varied. Hops became increasingly important in parts of Europe, although their use differed by region and period. Fermentation could create a relatively stable beverage. But beer was not automatically free of danger. Contamination could occur. Storage vessels could be dirty. The drink could spoil. And alcohol does not eliminate every possible foodborne hazard. Still, fermented beverages were important precisely because they were useful products of food technology. They were not simply emergency substitutes for water. Now imagine a medieval tavern. The room is dim. The fire is low. Wooden cups are placed on tables. Travelers speak quietly. The smell of bread and cooked food mixes with smoke. A drink is poured. The scene feels ordinary. For many medieval people, shared drinking was part of social life. People drank together. They conducted business. They celebrated. They discussed news. They rested after work. Food and drink were social experiences. This matters because food safety was not only an individual issue. Meals were communal. A single preparation could feed many people. If something went wrong, several people might become ill. But once again, we cannot assume that every group illness after a meal was caused by food. Historical evidence must be examined carefully. A disease circulating in a community could produce symptoms that appeared after a meal simply by coincidence. This is why historians need documents, archaeology, medical knowledge, and caution. The evidence for foodborne illness in the medieval period is real, but incomplete. Some dangers can be established through science. Others remain uncertain. This uncertainty should not make the story less interesting. In fact, it makes it more human. Imagine a medieval family waiting for someone to recover from illness. They do not know what caused it. Perhaps the person ate something bad. Perhaps they drank contaminated water. Perhaps they caught an infection from another person. Perhaps something else happened. The family can only observe. They may change the person's diet. They may use herbs. They may call upon a healer. They may pray. They may simply wait. Their understanding of disease is shaped by the medical traditions of their time. For us, the scene can feel distant, but the uncertainty is familiar. Even today, people sometimes become ill without immediately knowing why. The difference is that modern medicine has tools medieval people did not possess. Still, the basic human experience remains. Someone becomes sick. Others try to help. Everyone searches for a reason. Now let us step outside again. A medieval market is beginning to fill. Fresh produce is displayed. Bread is stacked. Cheese sits in baskets. Fish are arranged for sale. The sounds of bargaining rise into the air. Markets were essential to urban life. They connected farmers, craftsmen, merchants, and consumers. They also created opportunities for food to be handled by many people. Goods moved from producer to seller to buyer. Each transfer introduced another point where food could be damaged or contaminated. Yet markets also provided an important advantage: competition, reputation. Customers could avoid sellers they distrusted. A merchant who repeatedly sold poor quality goods might lose business. Local authorities could impose regulations. The exact mechanisms differed across places. But food commerce depended on trust. That trust was not always deserved. Fraud and adulteration existed. People could manipulate goods for profit. But we should avoid turning this into a universal claim. The majority of medieval food sellers were not necessarily trying to poison their customers. Most depended upon continued trade. A baker needed customers. A butcher needed customers. A cheesemaker needed customers. A merchant needed a reputation. Economic survival encouraged many forms of honesty. Still, dishonest practices could happen. A food product might be diluted. An ingredient might be substituted. A seller might try to disguise poor quality. Such behavior was not unique to the medieval world. It is part of the longer history of commerce. And sometimes, the danger came from something much simpler: improper storage. Imagine a merchant storing grain in a damp building. The first day, nothing appears wrong. The second day, nothing appears wrong. Weeks pass. The grain changes slowly. By the time the problem becomes obvious, the damage may be extensive. Storage failures were often gradual. That made them difficult to detect early. The same could happen with fruit. Apples and other fruits could be stored for extended periods under suitable conditions. But one damaged fruit could begin to decay. Rot can spread. The household must inspect the stores. A single bad piece may be removed. This is an example of a simple food safety practice that requires no modern science: inspection. People learn to look for damage. They learn to separate spoiled food. They learn to use older supplies first. They learn to keep storage areas reasonably dry. They learn to protect food from pests. These practices were not written as modern safety manuals. They were simply part of household knowledge. Now, picture an orchard in autumn. The air is cool. Leaves move softly. Fruit hangs from branches. The harvest begins. Baskets fill. Some fruit will be eaten fresh. Some will be dried. Some may be turned into preserves. Some may become drinks. Some will not survive. A household has to decide what to do with the abundance. This is one of the great themes of medieval food. Abundance could be as challenging as scarcity. When food appeared in large quantities for a short period, preservation became essential. A harvest of fruit could not simply be eaten before it spoiled. Drying could extend its life. Preserving it in sweetened or otherwise treated forms could help. Fermentation could create beverages. Storage could carry some fruit into later months. The same principle applied to meat after slaughter. A successful hunt or livestock slaughter could produce more meat than a household could eat immediately. Preservation transformed abundance into future food. Without these techniques, much of the seasonal harvest would be lost. So preservation was a form of planning. It was also a form of survival. But preservation always involved a trade-off. The longer food was stored, the more attention it required. The medieval household therefore lived according to cycles: harvest, preserve, store, inspect, consume, repeat. This rhythm connected people to the seasons. It also connected them to the land. Food was not something that simply appeared on a shelf. People knew where it came from. They knew the animals. They knew the fields. They knew the weather. They knew the labor. This closeness to food could produce careful knowledge, but it could also produce overconfidence. A person who had prepared food successfully for decades might trust their judgment completely. Usually, that trust was useful, but experience has blind spots. A dangerous contaminant can exist without changing smell or appearance. A familiar plant can be mistaken for another. A well can become contaminated. A preserved food can deteriorate unexpectedly. Experience reduces risk. It does not eliminate it. As the afternoon fades, the market becomes quieter. Unsold food is gathered. Some goods return to storage. Others are taken home. The streets slowly empty. The household kitchen prepares for another meal. There is bread again. There are vegetables. Perhaps cheese. Perhaps fish. Perhaps a small portion of meat. The meal is simple, and that simplicity hides an enormous amount of knowledge. The people preparing it know how to build a fire. They know how much water to use. They know when the pot is hot. They know how to cut ingredients. They know how to season food. They know when something is cooked. They know how to store what remains. This is not primitive cooking. It is practical cooking. It is cooking adapted to the resources available. The danger came from the limits of that environment. No refrigeration. No standardized food testing. No microbial analysis. No modern sanitation systems. No precise temperature control. Yet medieval people still managed to feed households, towns, armies, monasteries, ships, and cities. That achievement deserves as much attention as the dangers, because if medieval food had been universally deadly, medieval society could not have survived. People survived because their food systems usually worked. They worked through knowledge, through habit, through preservation, through cooking, through community regulation, through trade, and through generations of accumulated experience. The mistakes were exceptions within a much larger system of successful daily practice. Night begins again. The last customers leave the market. The road grows quiet. Inside the house, the meal is ended. A piece of bread remains. Someone decides to save it. A pot is covered. The remaining food is placed where it is believed to be coolest. Tomorrow, someone will inspect it again. This is the quiet cycle of medieval food. Nothing dramatic, nothing extraordinary. Just thousands upon thousands of small decisions. Some were correct, some were mistaken, and some could have consequences far greater than anyone expected. As we move into the next part of our journey, we will look more closely at another group of dangers. The foods that could change during storage, the strange substances that could enter ordinary meals, and the ways medieval people tried to recognize danger when their eyes could not see it. For now, the household rests. The fire burns softly. The stored grain waits. The bread cools. And outside, beneath the dark medieval sky, another day has quietly passed. The night is quiet now. The last firelight moves gently across the walls. The household has gone to sleep, and the food prepared during the day has been put away. A loaf rests beneath a cloth. A wooden vessel sits near the hearth. The grain remains stored in darkness. Outside, the streets are still. And for a moment, we can pause. We have traveled through fields and markets, kitchens and monasteries, mills and storage rooms. We have followed food from harvest to table and watched how medieval people tried to protect it. We have seen the dangers that could hide inside ordinary things. But there is one final part of the story. The medieval relationship with food was not simply a story of mistakes. It was a story of adaptation. People lived in an environment they could not fully control. They had to work with the seasons. They had to work with animals. They had to work with weather. They had to work with imperfect storage, and they had to make decisions with limited information. Sometimes those decisions went wrong, but most of the time, people found ways to keep eating. Imagine a small household at the end of winter. The food stores are lower now. The grain has been carefully measured. The last dried vegetables are being used. The preserved meat has nearly disappeared. Outside, the ground is beginning to soften. There are signs that spring is coming. The family has survived another season. They did not survive because every meal was perfectly safe. They survived because they knew how to manage risk. They knew what could be stored. They knew what had to be eaten quickly. They knew which foods could be dried. They knew which could be salted. They knew how to make bread. They knew how to preserve milk. They knew how to prepare meals that stretched small quantities of ingredients. This practical knowledge was one of the great achievements of ordinary medieval life. We often remember medieval history through kings, battles, castles, and political events. But beneath all of those things was food. Every army required food. Every monastery required food. Every town required food. Every household required food. Without the ability to preserve grain, meat, fish, dairy products, and other supplies, medieval society could not have continued. So perhaps the most important lesson is not that medieval people made deadly mistakes. It is that they learned to live with dangers that could never be completely removed. Consider grain once more. A farmer could choose a good field. A harvest could be successful. The grain could be dried. It could be stored carefully. The household could inspect it. Yet weather could still change. Pests could still appear. Mold could still grow. Some contaminants could remain invisible. The farmer could do everything reasonably possible and still lose part of the crop. That uncertainty was part of life. The same was true of meat. An animal could provide food for many people. The meat could be salted, it could be smoked, it could be dried, it could be stored in cool conditions. But preservation was never absolute. The household had to keep watching. And the same was true of fish. A fresh catch could be valuable. Salt could transform it. Drying could extend its usefulness. Trade could carry it far from the coast. But time was always present. Food changed. This simple fact connects the medieval kitchen to our own. Even now, food has a limited life. We simply have more tools for controlling it. Refrigerators slow change. Freezers slow it further. Packaging protects food. Thermometers measure temperature. Laboratories can identify contaminants. Modern food systems use rules and inspections. These technologies do not make food risk disappear. They simply give us more ways to manage it. Medieval people had fewer tools, so they depended more heavily on experience. And experience was built from generations. Imagine a medieval grandmother teaching a child how to recognize good grain. Perhaps there is no written lesson, No formal classroom. The child watches. The grain is poured into a container. The older woman checks it. She smells it. She moves it through her fingers. She looks carefully. The child learns. Years later, the child will perform the same task. This is how much practical food knowledge survived. Through observation, through repetition, through memory, through ordinary work. The same pattern appears in almost every part of medieval food culture. The baker teaches the apprentice. The farmer teaches the child. The cheesemaker teaches the next generation. The brewer teaches another worker. The herbalist teaches someone to recognize plants. Knowledge becomes tradition, and tradition can be remarkably effective. But tradition can also contain mistakes. A practice can continue simply because it has always been done. Sometimes that practice works. Sometimes it works only under certain conditions. Sometimes the original reason for a custom has been forgotten. And sometimes people follow a tradition without knowing its limits. This is not unique to medieval society. Human beings have always inherited habits. Some protect us, some do not. The medieval kitchen therefore gives us a quiet lesson about knowledge itself. Knowing what usually works is not the same as knowing everything. A person can be experienced and still be surprised. A food can look safe and still be contaminated. A plant can look familiar and still be dangerous. A storage room can appear dry and still have hidden moisture. A water source can look clean and still carry illness. The invisible world existed long before humans had names for it. That may be the strangest part of our journey. The medieval people we have imagined could not see bacteria. They could not see viruses. They could not examine toxins under a microscope. They could not test food in a laboratory. Yet they lived alongside all of these things. Their kitchens were full of invisible life. Some of it was useful. Some of it was harmless. Some of it could cause disease. Fermentation depended upon microorganisms. Cheese-making depended upon complex biological processes. Bread fermentation depended upon living organisms. Spoilage could also involve microorganisms. The medieval world therefore contained an enormous biological system that people experienced without understanding its microscopic nature. They simply described the results. The bread rises, the milk changes, the cheese matures, the drink ferments, the meat spoils, the food becomes sour, the smell changes. These were the visible signs of invisible processes. And medieval people became experts at reading many of those signs. Still, there were limits. This is why some of the most dangerous food mistakes were so difficult to prevent. The danger could be present before any visible change occurred. Or the change could be misunderstood. Or the food could become contaminated after preparation. Or a person could confuse a poisonous plant with an edible one. Or a storage problem could remain unnoticed. The possibilities were many. Yet medieval households developed strategies. They preserved food. They cleaned containers as well as their methods allowed. They protected wells. They kept stores away from pests when possible. They cooked food. They used salt. They smoked. They dried. They fermented. They stored food in cool places. They inspected supplies. These were not random habits. Together, they formed a practical system, and that system deserves respect. Now let us return to one of the most persistent myths about medieval food. The idea that medieval people simply ate rotten meat and covered the taste with large quantities of spices. It sounds believable because spices were important in elite medieval cuisine. But the reality is more complicated. Spices such as pepper, ginger, cinnamon, cloves, and others were valuable commodities. They traveled long distances. They could be expensive. They were used for flavor, prestige, and sometimes in connection with contemporary medical beliefs. A wealthy cook might use them generously. But that does not mean spices were routinely used to disguise rotten meat. Clearly, spoiled food was not transformed into safe food by adding pepper. Medieval cooks understood food quality through their own experience. They had no reason to deliberately serve obviously rotten ingredients, simply because spices were available. The myth survives because it creates a vivid image. But real history is quieter, and usually more interesting. The same can be said of another common assumption, that medieval people were unaware of cleanliness. They were not. They did not have modern germ theory, but cleanliness mattered. People washed, utensils were cleaned. Food preparation areas were maintained to varying standards. Water sources could be protected. Communities sometimes regulated waste and trades. The exact standard depended on place, period, wealth, and circumstance. But the idea that cleanliness meant nothing to medieval people is incorrect. People could see when something was dirty. They understood that dirt was unpleasant. They understood that spoiled food smelled bad. They understood that certain environments were unhealthy. They simply lacked modern explanations for many of the causes. This difference between observation and explanation is worth remembering. A medieval person could correctly observe that a certain well-made people sick. They might not know why. A modern scientist can explain the mechanism. Both observations are part of the history of knowledge. Now imagine a medieval physician sitting quietly in a study. There are manuscripts nearby. The room smells faintly of parchment and smoke. The physician considers food as part of health. Medieval medical traditions often described foods in terms of qualities and effects on the body. Different foods were believed to affect digestion and bodily balance in different ways. Some foods were considered nourishing. Others were thought to be difficult to digest. Preparation mattered. Season mattered. The condition of the person mattered. These theories were based on ancient and medieval medical traditions rather than modern physiology. Many of their conclusions were incorrect, yet they reveal how seriously medieval people considered diet. Food was not separate from medicine. It was part of health. A person's diet could be discussed by healers. Certain foods might be recommended during illness. Others might be avoided. Meals could be adjusted according to age, occupation, season, or perceived bodily condition. The kitchen and the medical world therefore overlapped. A household's food choices were influenced by more than hunger. They were influenced by culture, religion, medicine, wealth, geography, and tradition. This complexity makes medieval food history so rich. A loaf of bread could represent agriculture. A piece of cheese could represent animal husbandry. A salted fish could represent trade. A spice could represent a distant commercial network. A bowl of porridge could represent the daily work of a farming family. Food connected people to the wider world. Even the simplest meal had a journey behind it. And sometimes, hidden within that journey, was a mistake. Now picture yourself standing beside a medieval hearth one final time. The fire is warm. A pot is simmering. The smell of onions and herbs fills the room. Someone cuts bread. Another person prepares a bowl. There is no refrigerator, no electric light, no plastic packaging, no printed expiration date. There is only the food, the tools, the fire, and human judgment. The cook looks at the ingredients. They know what they have. They know how long it has been stored. They know what the weather has been like. They know what the food should smell like. They make a decision. The meal is served. People sit together. They eat. Perhaps they talk about work. Perhaps someone tells a story. Perhaps children are restless. Perhaps the room is quiet. This is what most medieval meals were. Not disasters, not poisonings, not dramatic scenes. Ordinary meals. Millions of them. The overwhelming majority of meals did not end in catastrophe. That fact is important. If we focus only on deadly mistakes, we can accidentally create a false picture of medieval life. The medieval world was dangerous in many ways, but people were not constantly poisoning themselves with their own food. They had working food systems. They had traditions that reduced risk. They had practical knowledge. They adapted. They survived. And survival itself is evidence of successful adaptation. Still, mistakes happened. Some were small. Some caused illness. Some may have caused death. But for many individual cases, history cannot tell us exactly what happened. We may find a record saying that people became ill. We may find a description of symptoms. We may find evidence of contaminated grain. We may find evidence of a particular poisoning. But often, the precise cause remains uncertain. So we must leave room for uncertainty. That is not a weakness in the story. It is part of historical honesty. We cannot turn every possibility into a fact. We cannot say that every medieval outbreak came from food. We cannot identify every illness from a few sentences in an old manuscript. We cannot know what happened in every kitchen. But we can understand the risks. We can understand the technology. We can understand the choices. And we can appreciate how much knowledge ordinary people possessed. Think about preservation once more. Salt, smoke, drying, fermentation, cool storage. These techniques are ancient. Some are still used today. Modern food production has transformed them through science and technology. But the basic idea remains. Control the environment. Slow deterioration. Protect food. Make it last. That is the central challenge. Medieval people faced it with the tools available to them. Sometimes the tools worked beautifully. Sometimes they did not. And sometimes the difference between success and failure was simply a matter of timing. Eat it today. Wait until tomorrow. Store it for winter. Throw it away. That final choice could be difficult, especially for someone who had very little. Imagine a family looking at the last portion of food. They know how much work went into producing it. They know there will not be more until the next harvest. They hesitate. Should they keep it? Should they cook it? Should they discard it? There is no simple answer. Food is not merely an object. It represents survival. That is why food waste could be so emotionally and economically difficult. A spoiled loaf was not simply a spoiled loaf. It represented grain, labor, fuel, time, perhaps even rent or taxes. A damaged animal represented months of care. A failed harvest represented an entire season. The decision to discard something, therefore, carried a cost. Sometimes people accepted that cost. Sometimes necessity made them take risks. This is where the phrase "deadly mistakes" becomes most meaningful. The danger was often not a foolish decision. It was a difficult decision made under pressure. And perhaps that is the most human part of the story. People throughout history have had to make decisions without perfect information. The medieval world simply gave them fewer tools. They had to trust their senses. They had to trust tradition. They had to trust one another. And they had to trust the food system they had built. Sometimes that trust was rewarded. Sometimes it was not. The morning has returned. The same household wakes again. The fire is rebuilt. The door opens. Fresh air enters. The first sounds of the settlement return. The food stores are checked. A loaf is brought out. A small meal begins. Nothing about the scene looks dangerous. And perhaps nothing is. This is the final thing to remember. The medieval kitchen was not a place of constant death. It was a place of ordinary human ingenuity. People found ways to preserve food without electricity. They transported supplies across long distances. They created breads, cheeses, fermented drinks, preserved meats, dried fish, and countless regional foods. They adapted recipes to seasons. They survived poor harvests. They shared knowledge. They raised children who learned the same skills. They passed food traditions across generations. And through all of this, they lived with uncertainty. That uncertainty was simply part of their world. As the morning slowly arrives, imagine walking once more through the medieval settlement. You pass the bakery. Warm bread smells drift into the street. You pass the market. A merchant arranges goods on a wooden table. You hear the voices of customers. You pass a well. Someone is filling a bucket. Farther away, animals move through a yard. Smoke rises from chimneys. The town is waking. Everywhere you look, food is being prepared, carried, stored, traded, and eaten. Behind each meal is knowledge. Behind each meal is labor. And behind each meal is a quiet calculation. Is it fresh? Is it preserved properly? Has it been stored well? Is this plant truly the one I know? Is this water trustworthy? Has the food been kept too long? Should we use it now? Should we save it? Should we throw it away? These questions may never have been written down in most households, but people ask them through their actions. They ask them every day, and their answers shaped survival. So, when we look back at medieval food, perhaps we should not see only strange meals or dangerous mistakes. We should see human beings trying to understand the world through experience. We should see farmers watching the weather, millers examining grain, bakers judging dough, cheesemakers watching milk change, fishers preserving their catch, cooks managing fire and food, merchants protecting cargo, mothers and fathers teaching children, workers sharing meals after long days, monks recording supplies, travelers carrying provisions along uncertain roads. All of them were part of the same long story, the story of keeping food alive long enough to become nourishment, and sometimes keeping it too long, sometimes trusting it too much, sometimes failing to recognize danger, sometimes simply being unlucky. That was the quiet risk behind the medieval table. The final meal of our journey is now finished. The bowls are empty. The fire has settled into glowing embers. The household is quiet again. Outside, the road stretches into the distance. Soon, people will begin another day. They will harvest. They will bake. They will trade. They will preserve. They will cook. They will eat. And the cycle will continue. Centuries will pass. The wooden bowls will disappear. The old kitchens will fall silent. The fields will change. New buildings will rise. New methods of preserving food will appear. Refrigeration will eventually transform the way people live. Science will reveal the invisible organisms that medieval people could never see. Food safety will become a field of study. Yet the basic human question will remain: is this food safe to eat? It is a question as old as the first meal. The medieval answer was built from smell, sight, touch, memory, tradition, and necessity. It was imperfect, but it was often remarkably effective. And that may be the gentlest way to end our journey, not with fear, not with images of endless danger, but with appreciation. For the people who lived in that world, food was work, food was survival, food was family, food was community, food was celebration, food was religion, food was trade, food was medicine, and sometimes food was danger. They lived with all of these realities at once. As the morning slowly arrives, the last shadows leave the room. The fire is bright again. Fresh bread is placed on the table. Someone pours a drink. The household gathers. Another ordinary meal begins. And somewhere, centuries ago, another medieval morning begins in exactly the same way. Quietly, simply, humanly, with food at the center of it all.